All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you, and great to be on this stage with these fantastic speakers here this afternoon. My name is Jeff Semple. I'm a journalist, a senior correspondent with Global News, which is a Canadian TV news broadcaster. I've reported from dozens of countries all over the world, including this year, spending a few months reporting on the ground on the front lines in Ukraine, which is, of course, a country that's witnessing a war and an invasion where misinformation was the pretext for Russia to invade. You'll remember the Kremlin claiming that the Russians were moving in to help liberate Russian-speaking communities from Nazis. And I can tell you from having been there that that's absolute nonsense, of course, but a lot of people do believe that in Russia and all over the world, including right here in Canada. So it is just one of many examples of the power of misinformation, which has exploded exponentially over the last several years. So our conversation over the next little while with these distinguished guests, talking about how news organizations should tackle the threat posed by misinformation, while at the same time reaching out to audiences, many of whom are increasingly skeptical of mainstream traditional news organizations, like the ones some of our guests work for here on the stage. So I will introduce our guests here. We have first on my right, Kiran Nazish, who is a former war correspondent herself, a professor of journalism, and the founding director of the Coalition for Women in Journalism, a global support and press freedom advocacy organization that is closing the gender gap worldwide. In the middle, Kevin Donovan, who is a chief investigative reporter for the Toronto Star here in Canada. Kevin's focus is on journalism that exposes wrongdoing and affects change. Over almost 4 decades, he has reported on the activities of charities, government, police, business, among other institutions. And on my right, your left, is Kalev Leetaru, who is the founder of GDELT, which has fundamentally transformed modern global risk forecasting, becoming one of the world's most iconic real-time open computing platforms. So a terrific array of guests here coming from very different perspectives, too. So it'll be a great discussion. Thanks for joining us for it. And we're speaking about backstage about who wants to go first. Some people didn't, so we will start with Kevin Donovan in the middle. And so, of course, Kevin, a colleague in the media industry here in Canada, but you've been doing this for decades. You've covered and uncovered some of the biggest stories in this country, but you've also watched how the threat posed by misinformation has evolved over that time. So what's your perspective on this topic?
Well, first of all, hands up if you've shaken hands today. This is class participation. So I dropped a giant boulder on my hand this weekend, and so I was worried about shaking hands with people. I go to the doctor, I tell her the story, she looks at it, it's going to be fine. Why does she believe me? So she's been my doctor for 30 years. She can see the evidence of my sore finger. So why do people not trust journalists when they say things? I'm just going to give you a couple of anecdotes. Back in 2013, I was one of the 2 reporters along with Robin Doolittle who did what we call in Toronto the crack video scandal. So I was one of the 2 that saw the video of Mayor Rob Ford smoking crack, the late Mayor Rob Ford. And when we came out with that story, nobody believed us. I mean, a few people did, but we were verbally assaulted. Things weren't as bad on social media back then, but we certainly took a lot of heat. We took a lot of heat for 6 months until people saw a video of the mayor of Canada's largest city smoking crack. I've covered a couple of wars myself, not like as many as you 2 have, but when I filed reports back, I would say, I didn't have any video, I would say I saw this happened in the field, and I think people believed me. But something happened in my experience around 2013 when Mayor Rob Ford did what, and I'm not saying he really paved the way for Donald Trump, but when he stood on a stage and said that my colleague and I were pathological liars and this was all anonymous sources. He was quite clever in saying those things, in attacking us, and saying anonymous was quite brilliant. And what we ended up trying to explain to people is they are confidential sources to us, and we cannot reveal them for a very good reason. Some years later, I did a big story in Canada before Me Too, but it was a Me Too-like story on a fellow named Jean Ghomeshi, who was probably the biggest CBC radio icon in our time. And that story, which I did with a colleague from another outlet, a fellow named Jesse Brown, 3 women came forward with allegations of sexual assault, and they did not want their name used, and we had to protect them. We experienced the same pushback, not from what we call Ford Nation, but from basically Jean Gomeshi, CBC Nation, saying, how dare you say this about our trusted son? The answer to all of this is, and we may be going to get into that, is people have to be presented with trusted news sources, and journalists have to stay in a business for a long enough time that people who are reading their information they're putting out learn to trust them. And that's the only way I can see to battle disinformation. I've recently been doing stories where I've been going to court and arguing on behalf of my newspaper, the Toronto Star, to try and get access to documents related to a high-profile murder case called the murder of Honey and Barry Sherman. And in that, I've found very few examples of people saying what you're reporting is not true, and that's because we have developed a process of really going out of our way to really source everything so that the story will show the reading public that it is as true as we can make it. And disinformation is a terrible thing. Obviously, I hate social media and what it's doing to our business, but I think if we push forward and keep trying to do our job the right way, things might change.
You mentioned social media there more than once, and obviously that you don't have to be an expert in this field to know that that has been a significant contributor to this problem and the discussion around misinformation and these big tech companies, their algorithms. If you click on one conspiracy theory, you get fed 5 more. And I want to talk to Kalev about that from the technological perspective, the data perspective. Kalev, what are you seeing from the tech point of view on this issue?
You know, it's interesting because, you know, there's a reason that they say intelligence and journalism are the same thing for different audiences. You know, because at their core, they're really about synthesizing and vetting information. You know, Twitter might give us the first glimpse of tomorrow's biggest story or tomorrow's biggest falsehood. And this is important because journalists, you know, they may get things wrong, but they strive for the truth. You know, they do their absolute best to vet and verify their information. But speed is playing a crucial role now in sort of unmooring some of journalism, within some parts of journalism, the focus on vetting. You know, because I've been both a journalist and on the other side, so both on the news gathering and news making side. And a few years ago, an interesting story, a few years ago, you may remember the story, Russian hackers had hacked into the American power grid, prepared to plunge the entire nation into darkness. This story broke, it spread globally across tier 1 media, all across the world were reporting on this. And as a journalist, I called the small Vermont power utility at the core of the story and asked for their comment, you know, expecting that they'd have kind of a generic statement. And it amazed me, their media person said, you were the very first journalist across the entire planet that has called us to ask what actually happened. So I ended up getting the scoop and actually being able to show that, hey, you know what, this entire story is false. It was a long, convoluted part, but it was essentially a game of telephone. Misinformation, you know, sort of misunderstanding by a government official became this. But what interested me was all these other news outlets across the world that in the old days would have vetted it themselves, just said, well, this one outlet ran it, so it must be true, we'll just basically regurgitate it. Because again, speed, you know, like your point about social media, everyone wants to be first. On the other hand, I was at a dinner party in a country when global headlines broke that there was a transition of power underway at that very moment. And, you know, and everyone's phone was ringing, everyone was looking at all these headlines, but as I looked at the other people at the table, these were all government principals, you know, these are the very individuals that would be scurrying back to their office or, you know, barracks and so on, dealing with that transition. And I noticed they're all calmly sort of laughing about the news, so it was clear there was something else there. And it turns out it was the opposition party spreading information on social media that in turn the mainstream media had picked up. And this all comes down to provenance. Where did a story, an image, a video first emerge from? And so my doctorate is information science, so, you know, information literacy is near and dear to my heart. But, you know, when did we go from don't believe what you read on the internet to trust that random stranger on Twitter? And that to me is really interesting. You know, we forget, in the US where I'm from, every library still, well, most of them still have reference librarians. You know, why do we trust some random, you know, tweet over a reference librarian that will actually help us understand things? And, you know, our focus is on virility and velocity instead of vetting and verification. And there is a danger now. When we think about anyone today can generate hyper-realistic text and video. You know, yes, there's toxic detectors and, you know, things that can detect GPT text or, you know, mid-journey images, but that, you know, the problem is the underlying technological infrastructure that powers generative AI today is also really good at defeating detectors. So at the end of the day, really the only thing that works is provenance. And in the art world, if you say a painting, you can say this painting is very likely by this painter, but the only way you can say it's truly verified is if you have that chain of custody all the way back. And that's where my work comes from with the GDELT project. We're a massive global catalog of monitoring global media across the world in 400 languages with the idea that we try to catalog what's happening across planet Earth. We emphasize local and alternative media. We have a 60-year archive of global news. In collaboration with the Internet Archive's TV News Archive, we have a 20-year archive from over 50 countries of television. We've already shown how you can take a video tweet put on Twitter that purports to be a clip from a particular television channel and actually trace it back and show, is this real? And has it been modified? And this gives an incredibly unique view of the news, of the information ecosystem. We can show you where stories emerge, how they're traveling through the ecosystem, how they're blending, how falsehoods emerge in that. So we can say, hey, this image that purports to be a protest in Tehran 10 minutes ago has actually been on the web for about 10 years now, and it was actually Cairo. In fact, one of the very first alerts of COVID actually came from our data, and during the pandemic, we worked a lot to trace how these falsehoods, because you think about it, every falsehood that you read emerges somewhere at some point. If we could trace that back, think of the Pope in the puffer jacket. You think about that emerged not, when most people saw it, it was kind of this question, is this real or is this not? But if you trace it back, if you actually saw when it first emerged, you said, oh, well, this is just a fashion, interesting generative fashion piece. And it all comes down to thinking of news as data. If we think of news as this global graph, we can watch when stories first come in, so by the time it comes to us, we can see that entire provenance all the way back. And I'll say, by the way, you were the first to hear that in a few weeks we will be actually producing a global real-time graph, a sort of a narrative map of the news media across planet Earth, so you can see, hey, here's the story. Where did this first emerge? Where did this come by? Now, we can't tell you what's true or what's false, but what we can do is tell you where that information came from, where it's been on its way to you, to allow you to make more informed decisions. Thank you.
Yeah, terrific. And I think that's a question that we ask a lot in newsrooms is, what's your source, right? I mean, we've got this story, we've got this bit of information, but I think, it's a great question for everybody these days. You see something online and where did that come from? Where did that originate? And terrific work you guys are doing to help connect people with the source. And increasingly difficult too when we're talking about information that's moving internationally, and that's sort of a segue to Kiran talking about the global perspective here and how this problem has manifested, not just here, Canada, the United States, North America, but right around the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think, first of all, I think sometimes when you're looking at misinformation, when you're talking about it, we have established already globally and in the West as well, that in democratic countries, that misinformation is bad and it affects democracy. And it affects the media and all of that. And we're trying to figure out how to get people to understand how to find the right information. But I think that one thing that we kind of are missing is that, and that's something that we have seen looking at press freedom and democracies getting affected with misinformation, is that it not only affects, it impacts the democratic structure, but it also impacts other things. It impacts our social, economic, technological abilities as human beings. How does that work? When anyone, institution, or an individual peddles misinformation, that trickles down into communities, people, society, different communities in a single country, and in regions, and so on. It affects our political, social understanding of mankind. It affects our ability to be able to cooperate with each other. That information goes into places like, our educational institutions, our churches, our how misinformation is being shared. It's essentially, in a unitary form, it is humans sharing misinformation with each other and then aligning the decisions they make in their life, and that affects democracy and everything else. It affects, I think misinformation is, first of all, it's an issue that affects, how people consume what they know, how they understand the world, but it also is a public health issue. It's a socioeconomic issue. And I think it is rooted in mistrust, and it also kind of amplifies a mistrust of each other. Now, looking at the press freedom, we monitor press freedom attacks against women and non-binary journalists, and when we are monitoring that, obviously we are looking at press freedom at large. And we have seen that misinformation growing really, really fast. As we know, it's growing in the West as well. And to an extent that India, Turkey, Pakistan are not the only countries anymore that have, impact of misinformation affecting democracy, voting, other stuff. We have seen, actually, some of the top countries in the last 3 years have been North America. Half of Europe is impacted by misinformation in a way that it affects voting, democracy, other stuff. And we see an increase of attacks on, when we see an increase of attacks on journalists, that is usually happening because of the misinformation. I did want to go through like a few things about how it affects from our quarterly report. So we just published our quarterly report of this year, 2023, and in that we documented 200 cases of press freedom attacks against women and non-binary journalists around the world. So we cover 128 countries, and in that, 82% of the press freedom attacks included some variable of misinformation. And by press freedom attacks, I mean not only online trolling and smear campaigns against women non-binary journalists, but also imprisonments, slap cases, detentions, deportations. In 2023, 55 major smear campaigns, all of them used misinformation. And the perpetrators are usually government, state, non-state actors, and we have a new category, anti-group. And that includes anyone that follows alternative news. For example, the truckers' convoy, anti-mask groups, anti-COVID groups, etc. And just finally, I might be running out of time, but I wanted to mention the impact this has on journalists. So misinformation-based attacks have led for journalists to be fired from their jobs, imprisoned at large numbers, physical attacks, including by police as well. They use, when there's a misinformation or a smear campaign going against about a journalist, they're more likely to get targeted in countries like Turkey, Egypt, when they're covering the front line. And it has also led to murders. Smear campaigns can mobilize people with so much hatred for journalists and the media that we have seen journalists getting killed in Mexico. 3 women journalists have been targeted after smear campaigns. So essentially, it paralyzes accountability, and I think that it is more than just an issue that affects the whole ecosystem of information. I think it affects humanity, it affects society, and.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. It's such a massive, multifaceted problem. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask you how to solve that problem now. But it's interesting. I mean, opinion polls in the United States, if you look at trust in media, there's definitely room for improvement there, and the same can be said up here in Canada. I mean, especially since the pandemic, we've sort of watched a decline in trust in media. And I hear it all the time as a journalist that people think we're working for the politicians or big business interests or whatever. From your perspective, though, Kevin, how do we combat that sort of thing?
Well, look, it's a huge problem on a personal level when people who are not bots but actually human beings criticize me for saying something is not right. I go have a coffee with them. I talk to them on the phone. Usually they back down pretty quickly because they just wanted to fire a bunch of crap at you and hope you're not going to raise your head up. And my personality is I want to go out and talk to them and change their mind, sometimes with some success, other times not. And the other thing is there's just got to be more of what we do and less of what they do. So you've got to do stories that are not just fact-based, but we show that they're fact-based. This came from a court document. This came from a government document. This person said this. And if you are going to use a confidential source, we always, in the Toronto Star, always say this person cannot be identified because a risk to their safety, something like that. So it's got like my little satchel of trying to combat misinformation, and we just have to do more of it.
Yeah, I remember visiting Washington, D.C., Kalev's home years ago, and went to the Newseum, which is great, and bought a T-shirt that said, "Trust me, I'm a journalist," which we used to sort of take for granted. Not anymore, and I think you speak to that well. I mean, in terms of the transparency piece, I mean, sort of pulling back the curtain on the reporting process. Kalev, when you were chatting before, you did sort of touch on sort of that solution piece in terms of sort of tracing things back to their source. Was there anything else you'd want to add on that?
Yeah, so for us, like we really see like AI, like people, AI as this it's a huge landscape, obviously, right now. For us, what we're really excited about, so we use a lot of Google's AI tools, and what we are really excited about is the ability of these tools not to generate content, but to help us synthesize that, to be able to say, here's something I'm reading on the, the internet, tell me the actual story, be able to connect you back to actually journalism, encountering some image on the web, and it purports to be something, tying it back to what journalists do each day in that verification. So, actually just using AI not to create things or combat journalists or do this, but to basically connect that, to sort of basically bridge that gap that's there right now between the ordinary public and this vast landscape of journalism that can help us.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think, personally, we're not perfect, obviously, far from it, but we lay awake at night worried about, did I get that story right? Or was, I just think you're just haunted by the possibility of making a mistake, which is obviously such a sharp contrast to this growing belief that the journalists have some sort of other secret agenda. And Kiran, finally to you, I mean, in terms of things that can be done to help address this problem, what would you add?
I think I'll pick from your point, because I want to talk about newsrooms and journalists, but something you said strikes, right? Most journalists go back home after filing a story. They think, did I get anything wrong? Did I get everything right? And this is something that happens to every journalist, especially when they're working on important stories. But the public doesn't know that. That is also one of the reasons that kind of mistrust and all that. And I think that in terms of what can be done, I think journalists should just do their job, which is report. But newsrooms can sort of focus some of the coverage on, I would say, this is my view, that we should have a little bit of empathetic coverage towards people and communities that are following alternative medias, or there's a reason people go for misinformation, and they think that is their real information, that is their truth. So I think as journalists, maybe we should dedicate a little bit of our time trying to figure out how can we cover them, go deeper into those communities, and talk to them empathetically. Not confrontationally. And secondly, I just want to say it's very important that we misinformation or mistrust in the media is an issue of society and democracy, and it's much bigger than the media itself. It's the whole ecosystem, and we do need to work together. We do that at the Coalition for Women in Journalism. We try to work with different stakeholders, especially public officials, government officials who really believe in democracy and want to. There's a lot of good people in governments and in the same countries where we would see peddling of misinformation. You will have people in the opposition and people who work in the same institutions trying to fix the same thing. So we need to collaborate more practically and on a daily basis with everyone to try to serve better.
Yeah, that's a terrific point, and I think it sort of echoes a bit of what Kevin was saying as well, in terms of just approaching the problem with empathy and being willing to have that conversation, right? And speaking of conversations, thank you, all three of you, for a great conversation here today. I'm sorry we don't have more time, but we are right on time. And thanks so much to all of you for joining us and for listening. Really appreciate it.